our first concert of 2017, the Jamestown Community Band. It's been, we're 1 week shy of 6 months since our last concert. So we decided after last year's February storms, where we had a concert in the middle of a storm week, we decided we better take winter off this year. So, of course, it was beautiful in February this year. Incredible concert. So I think we're back to having a February, somewhere between Valentine's Day and Ides of March. We should have a concert next winter. But thank you for coming. As usual, please stay afterwards, have some snacks, meet your favorite band member. Thank you very much to the St. Matthew's Church for letting us rehearse in the hall here and use this every week. And we appreciate your patronage and being here for our concert. Gives us something to focus on. We do have concerts every 2 or 3 weeks, all the way through the summer, till the concert on the Green at the end of August. So look for us all summer long. We'll be playing. And without further ado, our maestro conductor, Don, his name's never been pronounced wrong, Smith.
Thank you. Here we go. Thank you very much. That's Sedona by a new young composer. Actually, he's not as young as he was when he first discovered this. Stephen Reinecke, fabulous young composer, knew how to write for, well, he did some things for a young band, but this is not for a young band, as you can tell. It's very flashy and makes folks feel good. Wonderful little solo section in the middle. I want to recognize the folks who did that, Bob, and the clarinets and the flute, and also bass clarinet, who did a terrific job. Why don't you stand up for All right, as Tom mentioned, we were trying to run a concert in the winter, and the dates just never really locked in. So we're going to plan in advance for next year and try to make that. So what I try to do in programming is put a chestnut or two, really big pieces that we can work on, and then some lighter stuff around it, and that works well for the rehearsals. Well, this is kind of like a bunch of chestnuts because we had 2 concerts that were, and I didn't want to put away the ones that we had spent so much time on. So I'm very proud of the group. They've come a long way, but they've worked way too hard. This is the hardest they're ever going to work for a concert. We're going to make a promise right now. But you will benefit from that because you're going to hear some wonderful, wonderful music tonight. The next is, there were 2 guys from England that took a great risk in writing stuff for band. You see, at that time, if you wrote for the orchestra, you wrote for the symphony, you were a composer. And then there were these band people, you know, like over there. And a couple took the risk and wrote wonderful, wonderful works for band. And the first, and the one that I admire the most for that is Gustav Holst, who certainly didn't need to make more money. He didn't need to add to his fame. He was already well known to Planets and many other pieces that he wrote that were popular enough. He didn't need to do this, but he just loved the colors of the band. So he decided to try this, and this is the first major piece written for band, the military band. It's called his first suite, of course. He wrote 2. And we're going to do the Chaconne. This is the first movement. Features our low brass section in the beginning. And they introduce you to what a chaconne is, which is a melody that you're going to hear 15.5 times during the piece. But it's not going to always sound exactly, it's supposed to sound the same, but it's not exactly the same all the way through. It turns into minor. At one point there's an inversion. So you're going to, but it just, that same 8 measures just happens all the way through in different voices. So you follow that, you win the prize. You get an extra treat, an extra cookie. The intermezzo is a combination of a couple different styles and a real challenge for this group. And they rose to it. They played it the best they ever played it during our warm-up today. So I should have taken that. No, you're going to even hear that better. And then the final thing is called a march, but it's very stylized march. So Gustav Holst's first suite for military band. Irish gentleman, actually he's a British gentleman who took a chance, was a guy by the name of Percy Grainger. Came from a very different ilk than Gustav Holst. This is more, there's a bit of tavern and roughness in his writing, as well as the heart. That makes it, so we're gonna play for you the definitive arrangement for band, anyway, of Irish Tune from the County Derry, which everyone knows that tune, and this is the arrangement of it to do. And then we're going to follow that up, and I'll do a break in between. We won't do it as a multiple movement work. It seems like we'll accept your applause anytime. And it's called Shepherd's Hay, but I'll explain a little bit about it now. Shepherd's Hay is it's a Morris dance, but there's a very clear distinction. How many have you seen Morris dance? Morris dance, yeah, many people have. Yeah. You'll see guys, typically guys, but it can be women dancing as well, with bells on and doing very stylized folk dance from the British Isles. And it's still on. There's an indication right at the top of this that said this setting is not suitable to dance Morris dances to. You know, and if I was dancing, that would be pretty much everything. You know, so we'd be pretty much covered. Grainger Shepherd Hay is a tricky, ingenious setting of an English Morris dance tune. The keel row. Percy adds stylistically authentic contrapuntal, you would say many stranded lines derived from the melody itself. Percy commented on such of a piece as Shepherd's Hay, which was written somewhere between 1908 and 1913. Holst's piece that you just heard was 1909, so we're talking about the same time period. Where other composers would have been jolly setting such dance tunes, I have been sad and or furious. So you're going to hear a range of things going on. Maybe that's why it wasn't suitable for that kind of dance. So he prefers the passionate and the energetic and a lot of energy and passion instead of just the light-hearted dance stuff that we usually hear. An interesting part about this that was originally scored, the very first version was for flute, clarinet, horn, baritone English concertina, which our band claims that we actually have someone that plays the baritone concertina, Bill, in the back there. We're going to actually substitute an accordion for that. What a luxury to have a band that could just substitute, you know, for instead of the bass concertina, yeah, just have the accordion played. And most bands don't have either. 3 fiddles, 2 middle fiddles, 2 bass fiddles, and a double bass. So it was originally written for a very small group, and then about the 4th version of it became this, and this is the definitive version of that as well. Pretty much what Percy ended up doing. He was so clever at what he did. So I hope you enjoy the cleverness of that as well. So first we'll start with Irish Tune, and then Shepherd's Hay. We'll shake those tears away. She said it's almost a tear. It was that bad. So two, like I said, well, you see hard work, right? That's difficult. Let's give them another hand. That was a lot of fun. Hey, now I'll lighten up a little bit with some show music. Not that it's easy, but it's the Phantom of the Opera. It's haunting melodies that have been with us for quite some time now. Another Brit, right? Andrew Lloyd Webber. So we have a lot of things from the other side of the pond, from the other island. There's another way of looking at it, right? Just another island. Phantom of the Opera. All I ask of you, think of me, Angel of Music, and Music of the Night. I think you actually have that in your program too, so I didn't have to read that. Okay, so this is Phantom of the Opera, and I hope you enjoy it. more from that other island, and that's the. But they made a lot of money on this side of the pond as well. The Beatles, right? Michelle, Eleanor Rigby, and Yesterday, and you know, my students now, I ranger students from 4th grade through high school. They really don't believe that my parents and my father said, "You will not listen to them." That is, you know. Little did he know, years later I'd be conducting, you know, like I don't think as they were coming out, we realized just how brilliant they really were. Because they didn't just change one genre, they created all these other sub-genres within that. They're an amazing group, so we'll enjoy a nice light arrangement of these 3 tunes. things that's been missing from these concerts that's been kind of bugging me is that you didn't get to do anything yet. You know, now it's your turn. and something that's been kind of missing. This is a sing-along. It's one of the most famous marches ever. And we want to thank Judy Nelson, subsidized this, heard about this march, and said, I'll pay for it, you know? I think it's called On the Mall. I hope she didn't misinterpret and say it was at the mall. But, you know, like, what, you know, whatever. You know, like, it's one of the great marches ever. 1923 was written by Edwin Franco Goldman here in the United States, who was along with John Philip Sousa, the two March Kings. He had the professional band that performed just off of 72nd Street in Central Park, a band shell that was built for them that still stands today. And but unfortunately, the band ended in 2005. So it lasted all the way from the 50s until 2005 as a professional band. And there were composers from all over the world writing pieces for that band. Will you please play my piece? You know, so you know, quite a stretch from what I described with Gustav Holst taking that risk. It's well worth the risk. One of the best bands in the world. And this was their favorite march. And I've taken it through Europe. And you're going to sing along. And for some reason, people who have never heard this march know the tune. You know, like we'll sing along with the tune. So I just have that thing. If they can do it in Switzerland and Austria and Germany, you could do it too. I know that. So the first, but you need to know the words. Right? So you know, like what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you the text. I'm going to say the text one time. You're going to memorize it and then inherently know when to sing that when we get to that part of it. Are you ready? So listen very carefully. La. That's la 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 la. And they'll be singing along with you. Then the second time through, you whistle. Now, I don't know about you folks, but there used to be a lot of people walking around whistling, and I just don't hear that as much anymore. I don't know. My father was a world-class whistler. Singing, I don't know, but you know, whistling, he was right on pitch with whistling. La La Land just brought that back, right? All of a sudden, La La Land, there's some whistling, and I'm hearing a few more people whistle. I wonder if that's because of that film, or maybe because of this concert. I don't know. All right, so I'll cue you in. You'll know when it is. This is On the Mall. And from this side, now that we're on this side of the pond, we better stay here. We'll do Edmund Franklin Golden's buddy, John Philip Sousa. But this doesn't happen just by itself. And at 4:30 this afternoon, Tom Wiggin and the setup crew, I think it was Sue and Judy also were here, and maybe some others, and Bill as well. Okay, great. Setting all of this up, making it look fantastic. Thank you to them and the executive board for making this fantastic. Thank you to St. Matthew's Parish for providing a place for us to perform and rehearse. And thank each and every one of you for coming out and supporting us. We're going to do John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever.